So the next panel is going to be interesting. We have the moderator, Gillian Tett, is actually going to be online. I think that's going to be interesting, see how our technology holds up. But let me introduce the other panelists first, and maybe that's how I'll do it. First, let me introduce Daniel Diermeier, Vanderbilt Chancellor. You know some about him, but let me just point out a couple things quickly here. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He's published 4 books and more than 100 research articles, mostly in the fields of political science, economics, and management, but also in other areas ranging from linguistics, sociology, psychology, to computer science, operations research, and applied mathematics. And so he's got a very broad sense of places, things he likes to think about. Next up, we have Joyce Corell. Joyce is the Deputy National Cyber Director of Technology and Ecosystem Security Office of the National Cyber Director. She's joined the newly created Office of the National Cyber Director in September 2021 as the Acting Director. And prior to this, she was the Assistant Director for Supply Chain and Cyber in the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. She spent a significant portion of her career on various aspects of computer network operations, from capability development to the development of national policy and legislation. Thanks for joining us. Next up, we have Xenofon Koutsoukos. Yes, we're buddies, I know Xenophon. He's a professor and chair of the Department of Computer Science and a senior research scientist in the Institute for Software Integrated Systems at Vanderbilt, here at Vanderbilt. His research work is in the area of cyber-physical systems with an emphasis on security, resilience, learning-enabled systems, formal methods, distributed algorithms, diagnosis and fault tolerance, and adaptive resource management. Thanks for joining us. Yeah. And then we have Professor Michael Bess. Michael Bess. Michael Bess is the Chancellor's Professor of History at Vanderbilt. He's a specialist in 20th and 21st century Europe with a particular interest in the interactions between social and cultural processes and technological change. His recent book, his 5th book, study focuses on the existential risks posed by climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, natural or bioengineered, and artificial intelligence, surveying the solutions that have been tried, why they've fallen short thus far. Thank you all for joining me. And now we should have Gillian. Is Gillian?
Hi. Hi, can you see me or hear me? Do you want to put your wave?
I can hear you. I don't know if we can.
Fantastic, brilliant, wonderful. Okay, Wilson, thank you very much indeed. Do you want to introduce me or should I introduce myself?
Oh, okay, now I see you. I was sort of like this disembodied voice, I wasn't sure. So Gillian Tett is the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large in the U.S. of the Financial Times. She writes weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues. She's also the co-founder of Financial Times Moral Money, which is a twice-weekly newsletter that tracks the ESG revolution. That's a big thing right now, especially as I know in the business school. And so she tracks that in business and finance, where it's since grown to be a staple product for the Financial Times. Thank you and welcome aboard. So let's go ahead and take it over, Gillian.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed. And as you just heard, we are doing this session hybrid. My family is one of many statistics in COVID land where we've been impacted by health challenges. So unfortunately, I've not been able to travel to be with you in person. But given that one of the themes of today is experimentation and fresh thinking with computer science and blending hybrid, both real and cyberspace, maybe it's quite fitting that I'm doing this by Zoom, but apologies if that makes it a bit clumsy. But I should congratulate the organizers of the seminar because it is incredibly timely for 2 reasons. Firstly, tragically, war, both kinetic and cyber, is very much on everyone's minds right now because of the events around Ukraine. And so in the media, in the political landscape, in everyone's lives, and in the business community, there is intense focus on military threats, on cyber threats, on all these issues. But secondly, speaking as someone who trained as a cultural anthropologist, I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, I can tell you that the idea of trying to break down disciplinary silos and bring together computer science, social science, and all other kinds of sciences is very much a hot topic right now. Anthropologists haven't historically been particularly eager to embrace working with other disciplines sometimes, but today there really is a strong interest in trying to work out how studies of social systems can inform studies of digital life and other types of science, including, I should say, medical science on the back of the COVID experience. And in particular, there's also a growing recognition amongst many of the business leaders and policymakers that I speak to in my day job at the Financial Times, chairing the editorial board. There's a real recognition of the need for fresh thinking in tackling problems and trying to break down silos in all kinds of fields. It's an issue I care about deeply because I wrote a book a few years ago called The Silo Effect, looking at the dangers of silos in organizations and silo thinking, tunnel vision, which initially I saw playing out during the 2008 financial crisis, but applies to almost any sphere of life. And right now, as people look at the military and the cyber threats, both the question of how to avoid silo thinking hampering the response and finding ways to break down silos between the different intellectual disciplines is incredibly important. So, long-winded way of saying that I salute you all in terms of the work that's being done and this very important conversation. And as you've heard, we have a fantastic panel to look at these issues in many, many ways. But I'd like to perhaps start off by pitching a question to each of you and asking you for your thoughts. And I'd like to start with the Chancellor, Chancellor Diermeier, and ask him a question based on your research and your oversight of the work that Vanderbilt's doing. I made the point that whenever in the past we've had a massive technological shift at the time of warfare, of the sort that we are experiencing now, that has forced not just a change in the way that war is actually waged militarily, but a change in strategic thinking. I mean, the obvious answer of that was the fact you had the development of nuclear weapons, which led to the development of doctrines like mutually assured destruction, MAD. So I'm curious, when you look at what is happening today in cyberspace, what to your mind is the major area of strategic gaps in strategic thinking, and how can you actually go about filling them? And also, what role do you think universities should play in that?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for joining us today, virtually this time. And I should say that I've always been a huge fan of your columns at the Financial Times, and I love the fact that you're using cultural anthropology to study finance. I think that's a great example of what we're trying to do today, really to kind of bridge these boundaries and go beyond the silos of how we typically think about these issues. Let me just give you a couple of thoughts on that. And some of these things were touched upon briefly already in General Nakasoni's keynote earlier this morning. But I think when you look back at the history of warfare over the last 70, 80 years, we see that whenever there is a new technology that's really transforming warfare, there is usually the need, as you said before, the need for new thinking. And we had it certainly with the development of nuclear weapons that led to the types of strategies that you mentioned, mutually assured destruction, flexible response, and so forth. But it also, on the academic side, really led to the creation of modern game theory, which is my own home discipline. And one of the founding fathers of that, John von Neumann, of course, was heavily involved in the Manhattan Project, and then also was one of the founders of modern game theory, which is really a rigorous way to think about conflict or cooperation. I would say then, as these conflicts evolved and changed, and we touched upon this in one of the panels today a little bit, Professor Bernardo Mesquita mentioned that, the post-9/11 conflicts, which was a totally different type of conflict, kind of sub-state level or non-state actors, often in environments where state power, state capacity was low or non-existent, really led to very interesting collaborations between the academy and the military and state departments across the world, and also the economic development community. Why? Because what became quickly clear and what the academics had been talking about for a while is to understand conflict in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the conflict related, for example, to drug wars and drug production and collapse of states, really required an intersection between traditional military approaches, political development, economic development. You needed to understand the role of poverty, for example, and how it really influenced or was connected with political development and violence and so forth. That led to a whole variety of extremely interesting, I think, breakthroughs and understandings. And I think we see the same thing now with both cyber conflict, and I would also say with the war in Ukraine. So I think we have one of the most, I think, challenging aspects of both cybersecurity, but I think it's a little broader than that. And again, we touched upon it in one of the earlier panels, is this expansion of the role of the private sector. Particularly when we think about critical infrastructure, that's an obvious example, where in some sense our biggest vulnerabilities are not part of the traditional way how we think about national security, but they're sitting in private sector entities. The second example to me is really disinformation and the role of social media, where fundamentally the fact that we have these privately governed social media networks and capabilities, but they're now being weaponized by adversaries. So how do we think about that aspect? And then the third one, very new, but just as interesting, I think, and just as much worth to think about is Ukraine. So in the Ukraine case, of course, we start with a very conventional military invasion, but then the response is from the West is largely not military, but it is using economic weapons, kind of sanctions on steroids, if you will, that go way beyond anything that we've ever done, and very importantly, private actors taking action irrespective of what it is that the governments are prescribing them to do. So these are all, I think, particularly challenging aspects because they require us to think about the private sector, how it intersects and interconnects with the question of national security, and anything from how do we think about economics, supply chain management, how do we think about security management, both in the private and the public sector. All these things are not intersected, and I love the concept that Gillian Tett talked today. It's about a continuity of action, and I think a span of activities that go way beyond how we typically thought about conflict.
Well, I find that fascinating, and you touched on a number of key themes there. I mean, as someone who gets paid in my day job to cover what business is thinking and doing, I do think the point you make about the degree to which private actors, private companies, are now at the center of what one might call cyber mad, this new type of cyber warfare, and the degree to which that does or does not throw down a gauntlet to the state to intervene or guide or direct or at least collaborate with private companies, I think is fascinating. I want to come back to that later on. But before we do, having heard, how universities are trying to break down silos and think about this interdisciplinary issue, I'd love to hear from Joyce about how you see government breaking down silos at the moment. Tell us a bit about what the establishment of the Office of National Cyber Director actually does. What is it intended to address? What does it mean? And then can you give us some examples of how you try to break down some of these silos or go silo busting in government? Because, of course, in many ways, the public sector is the hardest area of all to silo bust.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. The Office of the National Cyber Director is a very brand new organization at the White House. The director is Chris Inglis. He was a former deputy director of the National Security Agency. And the idea for creating a position like that of a national cyber director and for an office to support that director was born out of the Cyber Solarium Commission. In about the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act called for a bipartisan commission to come together and think through the challenges that cyber presents from the multifaceted challenge. The members of Congress that pushed this forward were frustrated in their oversight roles of hearing about government agencies that were, constantly having their networks penetrated. So they said, enough's enough. Let's have a commission. Let's bring some smart people together. Let's interview people and come up with some recommendations. The group of people that comprised the Solarium Commission took this work very seriously and conducted over a period of 2 years substantial interviews. They made a number of recommendations. I think they had like 73 recommendations. The bipartisan commission leaders, which is Senator Angus King, who's an independent, and Representative Mike Gallagher, who's a Republican, both very well connected across the congressional branch, were able to get a large number of their recommendations enacted into law. And one of those was the creation of this particular office. It's very new. When Chris Inglis went through his confirmation in the summer time frame, he relates to people that I was 100% of the workforce. So it's a startup organization. We're here early days in May. The job title with which I was introduced was last week's title. So my first job title was employee number 6. So we're really standing up an organization. We're about 36 strong now, and we're going to build hopefully by the end of the calendar year to 85 to 95 people. So this is building a new organization. And we have good ambitions. We will be down the road developing a national cybersecurity strategy. As this administration, like every other administration, develops a national security strategy, their national cybersecurity strategy will be part and parcel of that. So there are basically with the creation of the organization, there are 4 key themes or outcomes that we're pursuing, and I'll describe a little bit about how each of these is intended to focus on breaking down silos. So one of the themes is having federal coherence. Can we as a government look across the federal enterprise and look at how organizations are postured to manage their systems and manage their risk? And is there coherence? Additionally, is there coherence in sort of the policy regulatory realm? So we as a government, as a nation, have, for example, in the area of managing risk from a supply chain perspective, as a government or companies, academic institutions also have supply chains. They buy buy IT systems. So when we source goods and services, we may buy them directly from a manufacturer, or we may get services from critical infrastructure owner-operators. So we have regulations by which we can shape the behavior of the industry. So are we doing this in a coherent fashion? And do we have a good sense of the authorities so that one authority is not being used in a way that is overly restrictive, whereas another authority is just completely ignored? So do we have coherence across the board there? So that requires talking to the private sector, talking to the regulators. Many times the language of regulators is not necessarily the same as the language of the executive branch. In listening to the language of the provost, she used the word surveillance relating to an interpretation of the word surveillance as to study something. So I come from an intelligence background, and I have colleagues in law enforcement, and surveillance is a very different word in that particular environment. So words matter. So can we break down these language barriers? I do want to talk there are four outcomes. One is we have oversight authority of budgets. So how agencies are resourced from a cyber perspective. It's sort of a soft power where we can look at where we can provide advocacy for agencies so that they have the resources they need. Many times, from a cybersecurity perspective, when budget cuts come around, those are the areas that seem to not get the resources they need and not be effective in the budget wars, the budget negotiations. Part of looking forward from a cybersecurity perspective is looking at our infrastructure and focusing on present and future resilience. So what that means and how we prioritize what kind of technology we want to invest in will become something that we focus on down the road, and would certainly look to the cadre of people here and the ideas generated here as what we would like to have inform our thinking, our national thinking, not just the government's thinking. But on the fourth area that we really want to focus on is public-private sector collaboration. About a month and a half ago, Director Chris Inglis wrote a Foreign Affairs article where he outlined his vision for the organization and referred to it as a new social contract. So in our tech ecosystem now, we have a poor distribution of risk management. So how do we look at risk management in a different way? And for the past 20 years, the private sector, the companies, the large well-resourced companies have tended to defer risk management to the users of those systems for these people who have less resources and less skills and less understanding to know how to mitigate the risk. So if the end user has to take on the risk, so how do we change that dynamic and look at the responsibilities differently between government and the private sector? So what does the government bring to the table? You heard a lot about that from General Nakasone, and I'm sure in the keynote wrapping up at the end, you'll hear more about this from Cyber Command. So the government can bring information to the table, and as Nakasone described it, actionable, accurate, timely information. So that's what government can bring to the table. But the private sector needs to bring more to the table as well. Gillian, as you were talking about, the industry has been on the front lines of cyber conflict. A lot of it from efforts by the Chinese to steal intellectual property. So the private sector has the systems, runs the systems that are under attack. So we should shift this, and to use military vernacular, where there's a supported command and a supporting command, the private sector should be the supported command with the government functioning in a supporting fashion. And this is going to require real collaboration. So one of the first things in this particular space that was done was at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, was the establishment of the JCDC, the Joint Collaborative Defense, I'm getting it wrong, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. So it's a government-private sector activity to bring government and the private sector together side by side to look at what information does industry have, what information does government have, and look to solutions for defensive issues. Another instrument that was recently created was the Cyber Safety Review Board, which is fashioned on the Transportation Safety Review Board. And this is the members of the board are looking at the Log4j incident as their first study and coming up with actual recommendations. So these are some examples of different ways of thinking about how to bring together in a more novel ways the government and the private sector for actual problem solving. So that's sort of just an introduction of where the organization is at, and some of the goals and the mechanisms by which we want to pursue these objectives.
Thank you very much indeed, and I find this absolutely fascinating. I was with General Dunford at the weekend, touching on a number of these themes, and he underscored the degree to which, looking at this from a long times perspective, the collaboration between public and private sector has changed quite remarkably in the last year. I mean, no one should forget it was a decade ago when the Obama administration proposed giving the government various powers to collaborate with the private sector on cyber defense. The original bill was, vociferously criticized by the Chamber of Commerce, who essentially blocked it. And the fact we're now in a situation where there is collaboration is quite significant. To me, one of the huge questions, though, and I want to return to this again, following on from the Chancellor's comments, is whether the private sector has woken up and realized the implications of what you're saying. It raises big issues about corporate governance. It raises questions about what investors should or should not be asking from companies, and how they manage their supply chains and make IT decisions. And the question of how that squares or doesn't square with innovation and our vision of capitalism is fascinating. But before we return to questions, I'd like to turn now for a private sector perspective, across to Xenophon, and particularly ask him, given you're actually sort of on the ground trying to make this work in the private sector, how do you see cybersecurity professionals, including academic researchers, trying to approach cybersecurity in modern conflict as an anti-disciplinary field? I mean, are the comments that we're hearing tossed around universities and the government now actually applicable on the ground?
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, we have discussed today how important cybersecurity is and how different agents and different organizations can explore the cyberspace for different types of attacks that attack our physical assets, our cyber assets, our social infrastructure, and so on. And although, I mean, coming from a technical perspective, technical computer security is very important. We have to complement our technical expertise with other disciplines in social sciences, political sciences, human psychology. And one of, I think, important points is that it is not enough to solve the security problems at these disciplines separately. We need to understand the cross-cutting implications that couple the private sector with the government, with academia, with human users, and try to understand how can we compose policies at different levels, at the government level, at the business level, with technical policies so we can ensure the security of our overall system. I think it's really important to develop a shared principal understanding of cyber domain. We need to understand what is the attack surface. And I think different organizations have a completely different view of what is the attack surface, what we need to protect. Back to the risk management, I think we need to see risk management in a completely holistic way. We cannot develop processes and systems and after that decide to make them secure. When we design our process and our systems, we have to understand that security is a first-class requirement, and we need to take that into account. We need to understand how to improve the resilience of our supply chains for different collaborations, how to have actionable decision-making when a company or the private sector can try to take a decision and have some that is actionable, and also something really practical that can help with this collaboration. And I think it's used extensively in the government, but we need to understand how cyber analytics can start helping the private sector, how different companies have access to data for which they can help them making better decisions about what is the adversary, what is the best option for prevention or mitigation of the attacks, and so on.
Right, well, that's fascinating. Well, that again points to a level of collaboration, or what some people in the private sector would call a level of government intrusion into the private sector, which we haven't seen for many years. And some people might call this novel and a dramatic departure from the kind of philosophy we had in the late 20th century. Others might call this a back to the future. We're going back to the kind of ideas and approaches which were really quite commonplace during the First and Second World War. So it seems like a good moment to bring in the historian and to ask in particular to Dr. Bess, Chancellor Professor of History at Vanderbilt. When you look at this from a bigger historical perspective, do you see this primarily as a kind of case of back to the future, that we're going back to the kind of norms about public sector and private sector collaboration that we saw in the first half of the 20th century? Or is this quite a radical departure in your eyes?
Well, thank you. I see, I guess historians are trained to see both ruptures and continuities. It's very clear, the panel discussion this morning, we're in many ways in an entirely different, new kind of game. I teach a class on World War II. The types of challenges and threats that we're discussing in the panel this morning are in a qualitatively different domain. The attribution problem was not a problem in World War II. And this just the decentralized, the rapidly changing nature of these threats means we're in some ways in a new game. Even the notion of war and peace, are we at peace or are we at war? We're in a sort of gray area where we have adversaries and rivals, and then there are at the state level, and then there are other kinds of actors like the hackers. So clearly, all these things point to it being a qualitatively new era in that sense. Where the continuities lie is, I think, and this emerged from very clearly in several comments in the panel this morning, states still have areas of common interest that they can find among themselves. And one of the key goals that I think emerges from all this is, just as it was the case during the Cold War with more, with kinetic weapons like the missiles, in this case, you would like to try to get some sort of arms control. You would like to get some sort of reduction of the uncertainty, of the nervousness with which the decision makers are having to conduct make their decisions. What kind of arms control agreement could you have in this new environment where attribution is so much more difficult? One of the things that has been proposed, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, said we need a digital Geneva Convention where we agree, we get together with the other countries, it's in our common interest. We need to agree not to launch major cyber attacks against each other's civilian infrastructure in peacetime. Now, granted, peacetime is a little bit more of a dodgy concept now than it was in World War II, but I think we can still make a meaningful distinction, and I think that would be a valuable first step toward reducing the nervousness and the uncertainty if we could achieve that kind of agreement. And there, as a historian, there are precedents. You can't have a treaty like the SALT Treaty because we're not really counting weapons, or we don't know how to pinpoint where the weapons are. That was what the SALT Treaty did. Here we're talking about weapons and forms of attack that are either rapidly emerging, we don't know what could be coming around the corner from somewhere, and they're difficult to attribute, as we were discussing this morning. So the idea would be to go toward behavior-based agreements or treaties. And there's a track record. The Geneva Convention of 1925, the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the 1972 Bioweapons Convention, and then more recently, 1997, the chemical weapons. And just last month, the Biden administration announced a unilateral moratorium undertaken by the United States on anti-satellite weapons. So these are behavior-based treaties where you don't have to count the uncountable cyber weapons. They're actually doable. And I think in that sense, then you still have the thorny problem of attribution. How do you verify? But overall, I think as long as we understand that there are these, one of the continuities here is that there are still common interests, even for nations like Russia and America today that are clearly in conflict with each other, or just adversaries when you're not in conflict with each other, you still have these areas of common interest. And so I think pursuing that sort of treaty, I think, would be in everybody's interest, and because it would help reduce the danger of escalation, the uncertainty, the nervousness, which I think pose dangers that are in nobody's interest.
Well, it certainly sounds like a brilliant idea, and I think everyone in the room would say yes. And it's worth pointing out that when things like the Geneva Convention were first proposed, they were seen as being a sort of pie in the sky dream that no one would actually uphold. And yet, as we've seen just in the recent reporting out of Ukraine, the Geneva Convention has laid out a baseline that people constantly refer to in all kinds of ways. But I'm curious, do you think there's any sign of support for that type of cyber type convention where people would agree to, not attack civilian infrastructure? And, even if we could do it, what would you do about the non-state actors or the, groups like Anonymous, which, are playing quite an unexpected role in the Ukraine conflict?
That's an excellent question. I think what I saw emerging in Kevin Mandia's comments this morning on the panel, and also Richard Clarke has written a book about cyber threats, former advisor to many different presidents. When it comes to managing that sort of agreement, you switch the onus of attribution, in a sense, from let's say I've come under attack, and now under the current system, I have to try to identify somebody and say, you are responsible. We're going to try to hold you accountable, and they say, of course, no, it wasn't us. It was the hackers. And so what Clarke proposed in his book on this topic was you reverse it and you say, if an attack has come from a certain territory, well then the nation that occupies that territory is going to be held accountable, A, to try to prevent or regulate those kinds of hackers, but certainly they're going to be held accountable if there's been an attack, to say we're going to punish or curtail that sort of behavior. It's true, and Clarke goes on to admit, you could, if you are a nation that harbors those type of hackers and they launch an attack, you could say that you're going after them, but then sort of only do it in a half-hearted way. And Clarke actually proposes something which sounds to me a little bit far-fetched, which is to say we could create something like the IAEA, create a United Nations body of international experts that can then sort of serve as an informal court to adjudicate, are these nations actually, if a nation has been accused of harboring hackers who have launched attacks, are you pursuing them with alacrity, or are you just turning a blind eye and letting them do whatever they want because that's in your interest? At a deeper level, what I'm arguing is that because we have an interest in not having a world where everybody is extremely nervous and forced into sort of hair-trigger responses that have the danger of escalating into a shooting war, it's in nobody's interest to be in that sort of world. Therefore, I think Clarke's idea of saying you have an obligation to assist, and if you're the nation state, you have an obligation to assist in policing the hackers operating within your own territory. There is the danger of false flags, which came up this morning. So if I'm a third party and I want to foment conflict between two great powers, I could try to launch a false flag and then get the two of them saying, accusing each other. But I was heartened also by listening to the experts this morning saying there are many that we're not as helpless with the attribution as one might at first think, that we can actually, in most cases, get a pretty good idea using not just technical means, but intelligence means and other methods. I think that I found that to be one of the most encouraging takeaways from the morning's panel, was that attribution is not impossible. In many cases, we can reach fairly high levels of confidence. Right,
right. Well, that's fascinating. I think it's going to be increasingly an important theme as we look at, what's happening right now. But I'm curious, I'd like to turn back to the question about and before I turn to the issue about different intellectual disciplines collaborating, I'd like to turn to the public-private sector collaboration issue and ask Joyce specifically, do you think the private sector is on board with what you're saying. I mean, as I say, the Chamber of Commerce blocked and fought very hard against a lot of the proposals a decade ago for collaboration. In your dealings with the private sector now, do you think they now realize that that needs to change? And to what degree do you think we are really talking about a level of government involvement which we haven't seen for 50 years? And I ask that partly because when I put to someone like General Dunford quite specifically, does this mean we're going to see the government in the future telling companies which IT suppliers they can use, what technology strategies they can use? He said, no, we're not there yet. But what do you think in terms of the work that you're doing?
Good question. So, with regard to your question about the private sector, are they on board? Certainly we've seen with the information that the government has been sharing once the Ukraine incident started, there's been a very positive reaction from the private sector on the information they're getting. They view it as actionable and useful information. Still, prior to Ukraine, there was still criticism about the government not being as forthcoming as possible. In the conversation about private sector, government, I would like to kind of throw out as an idea for folks to think about sort of the responsibilities of the private sector. We oftentimes see companies being driven by the bottom line and making decisions based on their quarterly figures of are you generating revenue? Are you making a profit? So perhaps we're at a time where some companies, maybe our critical infrastructure owner-operators, need to have a more patient approach to capital. And perhaps in order to achieve a more resilient ecosystem, companies maybe need to think differently about cybersecurity. You said cybersecurity needs to be security by design and upfront. So perhaps like in the telecoms industry, cybersecurity should be a capital expenditure, not an operational expenditure. The operational expenditures tend to be more fungible, and it's easy to not invest in one area. But as a capital expenditure, that's an upfront investment. To your second question about government involvement and telling companies what they should or should not do, what they should what designs they should have, or what who should they buy things from. We're stepping up, and I think you'll hear this on the keynote following this panel from Ann Neuberger. This administration, in the wake of the SolarWinds incident, published Executive Order 14028, which really laid out some hard and fast requirements for the private sector. So the government requires transparency. So we're going to be requiring software bill of materials from companies so that we know, what is in those things that we're sourcing from the private sector. The government doesn't really make things, so we buy things, and we need that to be a more open relationship. So for the government, we have put out a policy of zero trust architecture. The assumption that your networks are going to be compromised at some point. So as you design your architecture, or you have a modernization plan with that assumption in mind, put in some type of segmentation so that the whole system isn't compromised with just one incident. So there are things both government and private sector can do, and those would be ways the government would invest in the development of standards, cybersecurity standards. And this is something that is talked about a lot. The private sector has experts that they send to standards bodies. The government has some experts they send to standards bodies. But we the U.S., have not done enough in this space. And it's a hard thing to do. The individuals who are good at this have usually, they're either really brilliant and they're invented something fascinating, so when they go to the standards body, they have immediate credibility and immediate influence, or they have been going to standards bodies for several years and they've developed a reputation in that space. So from getting more people to do this, whether it's private sector or government, you have to look at your workforce and know that this person is going to be committed to this standards development for a period of time, so that your incentives to reward people for good behavior has to have a long view to it. So sometimes incentives and actual outcomes aren't aligned. So we need to think differently about that, whether it's in the government or the private sector.
Right. Well, I'd like to bring in Xenophon here because, given your experience in the private sector, do you think that people in the private sector are willing to accept this and collaborate and get on board?
I think the situation is a little bit more complicated in the sense that we cannot differentiate, we need to differentiate different companies and parts of the private sector. I will talk about a specific example that is very important these days, and this is all the software for AI and machine learning that is used across the board. There are some companies that create and develop software, the high-tech companies that typically we trust, I think the government trusts to provide all the software. And there are a large number of companies that are still users. They're only users, and they're not very careful with the security implications of using things that they should not. They try to have a competitive advantage over other global companies, and they have to be treated in a completely different way. So, it's kind of interesting to understand and have different incentives for different companies to participate in this ecosystem that we need to secure our supply chains, our software, and our processes. And I think different companies need different incentives, and we need to understand how this framework is going to emerge.
Right. And just before I turn to the others, I mean, in terms of investors, I mean, I don't see much awareness amongst institutional investors that I speak to about these issues and about the way the world is changing, not in a practical way. Xenophon, do you think that investors in companies are willing to accept, say, cybersecurity being treated as a capital expenditure, or recognizing that they may need to rethink some of their ideas about corporate governance in response to this changing climate?
That's one of the very hard problems. We do not have good security metrics. It's very hard to say to the investors, if you invest millions of dollars improving the security posture of a company, that's what's going to be your return. We don't have quantitative measures to make this argument. We try to use risk management, but again, our tools are limited. So that's a very important question.
I think that's a question that should be asked to the insurance industry, because the insurance companies, with all of the ransomware attacks that we see, the insurance, a colleague of mine, worked in the insurance industry, said his company now no longer, when they pay out, an insurance claim, if the entity who had been insured by that firm wasn't using multi-factor authentication, they won't pay out the claim. So that's one of the instruments of pressure that can be like a market force to sort of change some thinking, I believe.
Gillian, can I
But I mean, in your case, go on.
I just want to add one comment on that. I think this, this sense of like segmenting within the private sector, I think is very important. And here's another way to think about this, which is like, let's say you have startup companies, and the risk for them that they're facing from a security threat, even if they have an insurance presence, that's only one of the factors that really can kill them. And it may not be on the top 10. Top 1 may be we're not going to get revenue, we're not going to get enough investment, and so now having to also worry about that aspect is just largely irrelevant for smaller companies, I think, that are growing very fast. So I think we need to think about flexibility here, about how do we do that. In some case, an accounting treatment may be helpful. In other case, an insurance solution may be helpful. Another way, it may also be that we can think about, from a governmental side, how do we provide solutions, kind of almost like a standard that you can adopt, that may have some protection for that, but that's cheap and ineffective. So not everybody has to do the thing on their own. So I think being really clear about how do we think about segmentation among the private sector in a rigorous way is really important. And just to add one more comment on that, I think Xenofon's comment is like, what's the measurement of that? And then you want to translate that back. What's the return on investment in security structures? And the insurance side is one piece, but the other aspect of that as well. And if we're not able to really understand this from a kind of finance point of view, how do we think about this and how we manage it becomes much more challenging.
Can I say one thing about that too?
Yeah, please do, Professor Bess.
Just going back to what Chancellor Diermeier was saying earlier and the panel this morning. What kind of role can a university play in this regard? There was an appeal, in a sense, every person graduating from computer science should be required to take a course that integrates security thinking into their education. And I was wondering if, one shouldn't consider expanding that mandate, in a sense, to the university as a whole, so that part of our vulnerability as a country at this point is that so many people are clueless about the nature of this threat. And if we're going to be effective at deterring these kinds of attacks, we need to have public awareness of the nature of the threat and how serious it is. And I think a university, I'm not exactly sure how it would implement that in the curriculum, but it would be certainly an event like this one. But also, could one find a way to put it into the regular curriculum so that students at some level are required to have some kind of cyber competency or just an awareness? And I think that might be a way of, if universities start doing that, it could propagate awareness of the problem.
Well, it sounds to me like a brilliant idea, but Chancellor, I think you've had the gauntlet thrown down to you. Can you do that within Vanderbilt?
Well, I think this is part of what we see now is that this technology revolution that we're all part of. It changes, I think, our understanding for what it means to be a well-educated young person, and having no understanding of that, or having no understanding, for example, about foundations of statistics, data analysis, and so forth. That seems to be a gap that we can't really afford to have anymore. And so, we're doing this through the Data Science Institute and a variety of other initiatives where, Xenophon is heavily involved with. But I think there is a sense where we are, from an educational point of view, a little bit behind. And of course, the problem is whenever you add something, you have to subtract something as well, and that's where things get interesting. And so, but that should not let us off the hook to ask ourselves, how do we educate our students so that they're ready to be competent and responsible actor in this new world of technology? This is something that behooves all of us in higher education, I think, to think through carefully.
Gillian, I'd like to talk about that a little bit. So we all heard General Nakasone this morning when he was after his presentation. He was asked the question, "What keeps you up at night?" And he talked about talent and being able to, find qualified people, hire them and retain them. And he threw out the statistic of the centers of academic excellence. I think he said there was 350 centers of academic excellence. That investment on the CAEs has been many, many years in the making. And those relationships are with, four-year, colleges and universities and, advanced educational institutes. When we think about the sort of the cyber domain in our digital ecosystem, one of the framing mechanisms we've been using is to talk about the few, the many, and the all. So the few are those people who really need to be cyber savvy. These are the people who are your network operators, your network defenders. And these are the people that are the people who develop software in a secure development environment. So the capability developers in the private sector. So those people really need to have undergraduate and graduate education in technical fields. So then who would be the many? Well, the many would be when we all lived through COVID and we saw people having to go home and learn how to work from home and figure out how to connect to the internet and connect to their place of employment. So the many are people that need to have some cyber understanding. They need to be able to go to work and use software applications in their technology environment and know how to use those in a way that makes a difference. And the many are also those people that don't actually have cyber in their job title, but they are in a cyber adjacent field. So you have an acquisition professional that is procuring things for the CIO. The acquisition professional needs to understand what the CIO is saying and what they want to acquire. So the acquisition professional doesn't need to learn how to write code or how to maintain a system, but they need to have a little bit of better understanding. I would also give as an example the legal field. We have, when there are acts that occur, like the ransomware attacks, you need people who are investigators who are trained in these and understanding how to look at these systems, and in partnership with the investigators, you also need prosecutors who know how to understand the problem and then know how to communicate the problem effectively when they go into a court of law and try to pursue an indictment. So those people are in a cyber adjacent field. You're not going to take an engineer and say, oh, now you can be a lawyer, but you need to take people in the legal community and make them more cyber savvy. But that doesn't necessarily require a four-year degree in computer science. So when we talk about the few, the many, and the all are really everyone, all of our citizens. From K through 12 through people who have retired, what level of digital literacy, does everybody need to really be able to understand the digital environment and be able to realize the promise of the environment? So when you have someone who decides that they want to, develop something new and then market it, on, some online platform, what do they need to know to be able to do that? So that's a digital literacy issue, so that, as citizens of the country, whatever your age, you have that in play. And one of the things that we are doing, we're following your trend by having a summit. We're going to have a summit in about a month on the cyber workforce development. And the purpose of this summit was to bring together industry, academia, and people who use the system, and kind of talk through, this is sort of a call to action to generate enthusiasm, to then have a follow-on effort where we will develop a national cyber strategy. And this is for a whole of nation cyber strategy, where going beyond 4-year institutions, what do apprenticeship programs look like? We brought up what do we need to educate? The Department of Education actually has a competition where they have grant monies to teach K through 12 educators how to introduce digital literacy in K through 12. And there's a contest that the winners of the contest will be announced sometime later this year as to who the best teachers are in this, teaching digital literacy to their students. So the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, Department of Homeland Security has a role, and the Department of Labor as well. The Department of Labor is developing apprenticeship programs. So when we think about the education that people want and need, and we think about, maybe an analogy is to use a highway system that has on-ramps and off-ramps. So can someone be in an apprenticeship program or go to a community college and then go, if they decide that they want to go one route or decide that they want to go to a 4-year institution? So do we have a healthy, robust education system? So this is one of the things that we are taking on as a priority, as a priority for the Office of the National Cyber Director.
I'd say good luck on that one, because that's obviously a highly charged debate. Sorry,
if I can add something about that, I think it goes very nice in the keynote today. So I think we're doing a very good job creating talent that can help the cyber workforce. I think we can train computer scientists, social scientists. We're doing a very good job. I think we're working very hard to develop interdisciplinary curricula in order to help cybersecurity professionals with other disciplines. I think we have a much larger challenge educating the public about modern conflict. That needs to start much earlier. It has to be similar to physical security and traditional conflict. I think people need to understand modern conflicts, the role of the cyberspace early on.
Right. Well, in the same way that we teach kids, unfortunately, to do shooter drills and to think about those kind of, physical security issues, maybe we should be doing more on cybersecurity and many wider, issues around schools and things. But I was going to say, it's been a fascinating conversation. I think we could easily go on for another hour, but we have some fantastic keynotes and more debates later on today. So I'm not going to try and wrap it up completely or summarize it completely, but I'll simply say 2 or 3 points. Firstly, we are at a really interesting flux moment, caused both by these major technological shifts and the rise of geopolitical instability. There's clearly an effort to engage in a lot more, thinking and rethinking and essentially innovative ways of working, which is very striking. I salute the White House for trying to break down silos in public sector, which is always very challenging, and to engage in fresh thinking. I also salute what people are doing in the private sector to try and do this as well. But as I said earlier, I don't think much of the private sector, particularly the financial investors, have woken up yet to the big picture implications. It's clearly going to be very challenging. There are big lessons from history that can be drawn on, whether it's in relation to the Geneva Convention or others, but it clearly is going to be very challenging. But it's critically important. So it just remains for me to say thank you all very much indeed for this fascinating discussion, which leads in very nicely to the next keynotes. And I guess as a journalist, I'd say best of luck in figuring out how to put these very important ideas into practice. So thank you all, and I look forward to meeting you all in person, hopefully before too long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.